Welcome to episode 81 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. Now, a few weeks ago at the Cycle Touring Festival, which is great for listening to where people have been and gathering ideas for where you might go in the future on your bike, there were two people, Tim Sanders and Anne Lawther, who I've got to know quite well over the past few years, either in Tim's case via the Cycle Touring Festival or in the case of Anne because she is based relatively close to where I am, here in West Yorkshire, and they were both talking about plans to travel to Shetland and also, in the case of Anne, to Orkney. They weren't going together, they were going to travel independently, but in the weeks following the Cycling Touring Festival, that's exactly what they did. They headed up to the north of Scotland and onto the islands for some cycling. So a few days ago, I invited them to reflect upon their experiences of cycling in Shetland and also in Orkney. Now, we were joined by Jayne Moore. She was one of the people that Anne had actually cycled with when she went, and also the writer Martyn Howe. Martyn, he appeared on the podcast a few years ago when I was talking about cycling along the Hebridean Way on the Outer Hebrides, and he is a regular visitor to Shetland, so he seemed an appropriate person to also offer his opinions. But before we listen to Tim, Anne, Jayne and Martyn, this is the official version. This is what it says on the Shetland.org website about cycle touring in Shetland. Shetland offers many quiet roads in excellent condition for cycle touring. The beauty of the islands attracts those who are drawn to the natural environment. Outdoor enthusiasts love to push the boundaries by climbing the highest peaks, walking the long-distance paths, or cycling to the extremities of the land. Shetland offers the richest reward to those who recognise that Scotland stretches a whole 171 miles or 275 kilometres beyond John O'Groats. One of the best ways to see the real Shetland is by bike. Cycling offers the opportunity to cover the whole of the islands. You can set your own pace, allowing you to experience all aspects of Shetland life. Shetland has everything a cyclist could hope for. The various islands are accessible by regular ferry services, and with 1,000 miles of road waiting to be explored, excellent road surfaces and low volume traffic on even the main roads, cycling is a pleasure. Though the islands are far from flat, most gradients are gentle. Main roads are wide and many sections also have a hard shoulder. In most places you can see and be seen a long way ahead. While the hills may be predictable, weather conditions are less so, but that's all part of the challenge. If you do encounter a mechanical problem, there are cycle repair shops in Lerwick, and cycle hire is also available. So that's the official version that you'll find on the website Shetland.org. But what do Tim, Anne, Jayne and Martyn think? Well, I started by asking them to introduce themselves.
I'm Tim. I live in Somerset in the southwest of England, and I visited the Shetland Islands in the second half of May this year, so just gone.
Hello, I'm Anne. I currently live in Skipton, which is the gateway to the Yorkshire Dales. I went to the Shetland with two friends, Jen and Jane, who's also you're going to also hear on this podcast.
Okay, I'm Martyn, a long-distance walker and cyclist. I've been to Shetland as part of a trip around the North Sea, but I've also been to Shetland and Orkney several times independently as a cyclist and also in a camper van, so I know them quite well.
Hi, I'm Jayne. I live in Huddersfield. I went to Shetland and Orkney with Anne, and we went the first 2.5 weeks in May this year.
It's one of the areas of Scotland I've wanted to go to for a long time. I did think to myself about whether to go to Shetland as part of a trip to Orkney or just stick to Shetland. In the event, I just stayed in Shetland. I read that May is the driest time to go. Now, whether that means the least wet, it's difficult to say. But I would say that the 2 weeks that I had this May, the second half of this May, it was a lot drier there than it was in either mainland Scotland or the UK. And I can tell that from how long my grass was when I got back. I think there were times of the year when it would be quite a lot less hospitable. At one of the places I stayed at, the landlady had a polytunnel, except this was a polycarbonate tunnel. A polytunnel made of polythene would last about a year. But when you look at them, the hoops were made of really substantial galvanised metal that came from salmon farms. The roofing material is 1/2 inch thick polycarbonate. That's held on with 4x2 inch timber, which is substantial. They frequently get winds in excess of 100 miles an hour, so that might not be a good time to be cycle touring. I mean, I have a fondness of going to Scotland anyway. I've done the West Highland Way in January. I've done some cycling in Scotland before, but more, for example, we both at separate times did the Outer Hebrides. I've seen a lot of other Scotland, but the Shetlands was just an area that I'd not been to before. But it's a place I would like to go back to for sure.
It was my first visit to both Shetland and Orkneys. It's been on my places to visit for a long time. I've been to Scotland on several cycle tours, the Hebrides, a lot of the Isles, after the North Coast, mainland, some of mainland Scotland, and never been to Shetland and Orkneys, and I just felt I'd like to see them. I've heard from people who've been, they're saying, I hear this, it's otherworldly, it's so different, it's, as you correctly say, there is also the negative, the wind, the lack of trees, the exposure, but it sounded quite a wild place, and it really appealed to me, and I really wanted to go out there. And also, you get there by ferry, which is always a great reason to visit somewhere.
For me, Shetland was the next natural progression. I'd cycled from Land's End to John O'Groats in 2017, and I always knew there was that little bit of extra Scotland at the top. And when we were discussing places to go, I don't know whether Anne mentioned Shetland first or me, but it was like, yeah, it's definitely a place I want to go. Anne told me about the weather. We could hit bad weather. We'd have to be prepared for that. But our research showed us that May was probably the best month in terms of midges and dryness, and the wind is the wind. So we were prepared for the wind.
Well, it's absolutely beautiful. Orkney is particularly beautiful, particularly the remote islands. Shetland is 61 degrees north. It's a long way north, and it's very wild. I know the weather can be bad. In fact, there's a little button that you press when you get to Hermanus, and it tells you about the storm of 1991. Which I think was on New Year's Eve, where they recorded a wind speed of 197 miles an hour, which I think must be getting on for a record in the British Isles. But the story the local man tells you of, cars and roofs taking off is absolutely horrifying. And I just find it's wild. The bird life is superb. The vistas and the landscape and the seascapes are excellent. And if you really get out into some of the remoter parts of Shetland, it's not so much like Scotland, it's more like Scandinavia. And it's definitely got that Scandinavian touch to it. And there's a strong connection between Shetland and Norway. A book you'll come across is called The Shetland Bus, which talks about how the people of Shetland supported the Norwegians during the Second World War, and it's very well known in Norway, but it's not very well known in the British Isles, but there's a very good cultural heritage centre in Lerwick, and there's a good museum in Scalloway as well. So there's a lot of rich heritage and culture and art, which is worth exploring, not just the landscapes.
I took the overnight ferry from Aberdeen. That runs daily. You get on at either 5 p.m. or 7 p.m, depending which day it is. The 5 p.m. ferry calls in briefly at Kirkwall on the way to Lerwick. It gets to Kirkwall around about 11 p.m. and then into Lerwick at about 7 a.m. Or if your ferry leaves Aberdeen at 7 p.m, as it does on some days, then it goes straight to Lerwick. Ideally, I would have gone by train and bike, but I couldn't get bike reservations that worked for me, so I drove. But quite a few others that I met doing similar to me, they did get trains. So there are other ways to get to the Shetlands. You mentioned going via the Orkneys or going via Scrabster, Thurso. I can only talk about the Aberdeen route. Yeah, my recollection is the actual ferry passenger fare was sort of £30-40, but the cabin fees varied between 60 to 120. I mean, you could pay more for an outside cabin. I wanted to go for a cabin because if you have a car, you can lock your stuff in the boot, and options there which are a lot cheaper. You have reclining seats or these pods. Everyone I met that used those didn't sleep particularly well, whereas I thought, well, it's a hotel for the night, so I went for a cabin. Unfortunately, I was too late to book a 2-berth cabin for the routes I did, so I had to pay a bit more, something like 110 instead of 60, 70 for 4-berth. But the 4-berth was quite useful to dry the tent out on the way back. It would be a lot cheaper to do it without the cabin. I can't just recall whether you have to book something. I think it'd be on the North Link ferry website, obviously, but I think you might pay extra for a reclining seat, more still for a pod, and obviously more for the cabins. But the cabins do go quite quickly in terms of booking.
Yeah, with a small camper van, I tell you that catching a ferry to Shetland is cheaper than catching ferries to Europe. It seems to me that ferries to Europe are quite expensive at the moment. But I have come back without booking anything, just me as a passenger in the bike, and slept in the bar sort of thing underneath a television on repeat for 24 or however long the crossing is. That's not particularly pleasant. I found the pods are quite good, and I haven't actually stayed in a cabin at all. But it's just one of the things that you have to put up with, unless you go, of course, you sort of break it up and go to Orkney first and then spend some time there. And then I think you can get a day crossing. So that it's quite nice taking the day crossing, either on the way back or the way there, because you go past Fair Isle. And, sometimes the vessel goes past there, and that's quite interesting. It's a long ferry journey, but I didn't find it particularly expensive.
We looked at maps of Shetland. There's actually quite limited roads, so you can fairly much plan your route around the existing roads. We want to see as much as we could. So if, for example, when we arrived in Lerwick, the most southern point is a place called Sunborough, and we really wanted to go down to the southern point of the Shetlands. So it was literally one road down and then turn round and ride it out again. So that's exactly what we did. And then back through Lerwick. So we went in and out of Lerwick a few times, about 3 times in total on the holiday, to try and cover as much as we possibly could. So yes, we had looked at maps. Yes, we'd made some GPX tracks. But yes, as you do on tour, you then can adapt if need be. But I quite like having an idea of a route and where to aim for, mainly because of accommodation. Although we're carrying tents and are prepared to wild camp, which is legal in Scotland, it's still good to have a route and some idea of where to go for. And because, as we keep mentioning, the weather is unpredictable, it's nice to have an escape plan.
Yeah, I think if you look at the topology of the roads, it's really one road going from Sunborough all the way up to the top with a few interconnecting ferries that take you on to Yell and to Unst. There are a couple of small, single track roads which are alternative routes, but really there's a spur that goes out to Sandnes and there's another spur that goes out to Eshenes and Featherland, and really you're into cycling the length of those and then turning around and coming back again. So there's not many sort of circular topology routes on Shetland.
I was sort of responsible for planning the Shetland routes. So we aimed for about 35 miles a day with 3,000 feet of climbing. So that's what we were guided by because we were carrying full cycle touring panniers. And as has been said, there was the one road down, but on the maps that I used, there was like a cycle route. Route 1 was actually marked on the maps, albeit not sort of in use now, but it did take you off on several loops. So when we went down on the east coast and then we came back up the main road, then we diverted off to the Scalloway side of things, and then when we went up towards Bray we took in another loop on the west, and then we did another loop from Bray. So we sort of felt that we covered most of it. And then obviously when you go up onto Yell, there are actually two roads. You can go up one side and back down the other just for a change. So there were variations that you could plan into it, albeit obviously they're not very big islands. But up on Unst, it is literally just one road up and back. But at the top of Unst is where Route 1 begins, and that goes all the way down to Dover. And I think it said 1,695 miles. So Route 1, it made a big thing of Route 1 being the origin right up at the top of Unst. And then you could technically trace it all the way down to Dover as a cycle enthusiast, if that's what you wanted to do.
Well, I think that the roads are the roads, aren't you? Not much has changed up there in decades. So, but I think it's just the Sustrans are reclassifying for safety reasons. And what I would say is that the roads that do go the length of the Western Isles and do go the length of Shetland, all traffic uses them, including heavy traffic, lorries, and what have you. So, even though there's not much traffic, there really aren't many alternatives. There are some loops around them on the single track roads, but I think you just get pedantic about what it actually means to be National Cycle Route 1. But I think it's a safety concern, even though I didn't find any particular problems. But you just have to be, experienced and happy about cycling on A roads, knowing that there could be a lot of heavy traffic on those because there are no alternatives. An A road is the major road, but they can be single track lanes in some cases.
Firstly, back on the point of Route 1, all the signs that we passed for Route 1 were all clearly labelled, and they were full. It seemed to me like they were fully actioned. And we went on a lot of single track roads with passing places. But I would just say that our experience of all the motorists we encountered was extremely patient and polite motorists. We had motorists that were waiting behind us, probably 10, 15 metres behind us, and waiting for ages to pass us. And sometimes we even thought, it's getting a bit frustrating because they won't overtake us. But even on the A roads, everybody was polite, kind. I didn't feel threatened at all, and I know Anne didn't, because they just seemed geared up for the fact that they're going to encounter cyclists, and there was just no pressure on feeling unsafe or anything.
I came across a young Dutch chap a couple of times who was doing the North Sea cycle route. So he'd done the Scandinavian countries, then flew over to Aberdeen and was going right to the top to get to the most northerly point of Route 1 before heading south. But I was going to just supplement what Jayne said. The standard of driving of drivers was outstanding. They would they'd wait a long time back. If it was a long distance between where I was and a passing place, I'd quite often either pull in or just cycle along the gravel so they could get past. But the other thing I was going to add is that the amount of traffic was quite variable. When I cycled through Yell on the main road, which is on the west side of the island, once I was a few 100 meters away from the ferry ports, the roads were deserted because most of the vehicles that came off were either going somewhere on Yell, having got off the ferry, or going all the way on to Unst. So if you are on some of those roads on the islands outside of when the ferry timings are, you may well get quite a quiet route. The bits that I remember that were quite busy were sort of north of Scalloway, so on the mainland, on the 970 that is so in the northern half of the mainland. That was quite busy, but in that instance there were minor B roads that I could take to bypass that. A lot of it is timing. But even the lorries, they gave you plenty of space, but I would, as a matter of course, just tend to move over because, well, I'm on my holiday, they might be hard at work.
Yeah, no, just coming back to the transport. At the time that I did it, there was a flight that went from Sunborough to Bergen for Eurovelo 12. And I was just going to wrap my bike up and stick it on. I can't remember the name of the airline. But in the end, for other reasons, personal reasons, I came all the way back to London and flew out from Heathrow to Bergen to carry the journey on around Eurovelo 12. So there's no longer any ferries at all. There used to be a ferry some time ago, and I think you could get some ferries from Scotland some time ago, and the particularly adventurous can see if they can hitch a lift on a cargo vessel. But I think that's quite difficult to organise. But that was the main reason I went to Shetland as a cyclist, was as part of the Eurovelo 12 or the North Sea cycle route. But I have been back before, and I think that just exploring, the outer edges of Shetland and some of the islands, particularly Fetler, is really very good. And going out to Eshenes and going out to places like St Ninian's Isle, which has got a tremendous tombola, and a few of the other places, particularly to see the archaeology. It's worth using the bike to. I've done that on a bike as well, where I've just literally gone to the coast and come back again, just to explore these things. So it's a place where you could go there and you could cycle the length of it within a couple of days, or you could spend 2 weeks on there exploring every nook and cranny. And I think that's probably a good idea to do that, because there's an awful lot there, and you'll find yourself going back, as I have done, to really get into the island and the heritage and the culture, because it is very interesting.
The only thing I did in terms of booking up, I stayed in an Airbnb in Lerwick the first 2 nights. That was partly so I could do the park run up there on the Saturday morning. The park run occurs on Bressay, which is a small island just to the east of Lerwick. It's a 7-minute ferry journey, and having done the park run, which finishes at a cafe in a former school, so I had a park run breakfast there. I then took the opportunity to explore Bressay. But largely it was, other than the Airbnb, it was largely making it up as I go along. But that was all in campsites after the Airbnb.
We had a complete mixture. We did camping, we did both wild camping, which is legal in Scotland. We did some campsites. We used the hostels. We used Airbnb, independent hostels. So yeah, it was a real mix. And cabins. We used the campsite. Some of the cabins have got very basic. It's none of the glamping. Glamping doesn't actually come anywhere near the cabins that we used. They were very basic, basically wooden sheds, which were in a campsite, but were very good because, of course, there's that little bit more room to move around, and safe putting the tent up, and cost effective because there were 3 of us splitting the cost. They were a really good option. Some of it had been planned, but there's a lot left to chance. So hence, when I say some of the wild camps, actually we had 2 unofficial two camps that we've managed to blag our way into. One being in a church on Unst, and the second being a pub on the way south. So and that was just simply by asking if we could possibly use the facilities. Because of the wind, it wasn't so much the rain, but it was a little bit cold, a little bit windy. And I just quite frankly didn't fancy putting the tent up, so you try and blag somewhere, which worked quite well.
Yeah, they have something on Shetland. There's two unique things I found. Is they have something called bods, which are sort of Shetland mini hostels or something like that. And then the other thing they have is that there's a lot of campsites which are coincident with the marinas. So if you go to a marina, there's normally the possibility to stay there as well. And maybe it's for camper vans, but normally they have a little grass pitch. And there's a particularly good hostel on I think it's Uea Sound, if that's how you pronounce it, and which I think is well known. And I've been there before, but it's been difficult to get into it because I think it's so popular. And then there's the wild camping, which is something as a cyclist I think is really interesting to explore because you can get to some go down some really rough tracks, for example, if your bike is able to do that, and maybe get to a beach and wild camp there is particularly good. Plus, where the ferries cross onto Instant Yell, they'll have toilet points, so you can normally cycle down the road a little bit or something like that, and you've got a facility. Plus, you've got access to the ferry that you might want to catch in the morning. But I think the notable marinas, there was one at Bray, and there's several in the south as well. But I use those quite a lot, and they have very good facilities and they're very relaxed.
I think it would be the church at the very north of Unst, because I've never camped in a church before, but it was just right on the top of a hill with beautiful views. We had a great sunset. Again, we could have camped there apart from the wind, so we'd have either been camping there or not. But it was about 15 minutes away from the beach where the Route 1 sign is, which we went to the next morning for a wild swim. So I think for me to be right at the north of the Shetland Islands on Unst, camping there was pretty special. And also right at the south, we wild camped, but we were close to the lighthouse at Sombra Head. And again, sunset was amazing, and it was very remote and beautiful. Anne is very, very persuasive when she's deciding that she doesn't want to camp because of the wind. So we found the church. It was unlocked. It was open. So then we just knocked on a couple of doors and we found the person that mows the lawn for the church, and he contacted the vicar and he said, obviously he could see we were three middle-aged ladies. We weren't going to trash the place, and we left it as we found it, and he was more than happy just to let us as a one-off to stay there. So it's pretty special. You need to have Anne's sad face as well to persuade people that we're desperate and we need shelter.
I might not get away with it. I might not get away with that. After the 2 Airbnbs in Lerwick, I then spent 2 nights at the Leavenwick campsite, which is maybe about 2/3 of the way down from Lerwick to Sombra. So it meant that I could leave my stuff at the campsite and just cycle relatively lightly down to Sombra. And that was most enjoyable. And on the way back, I took a B road that took me via St Ninian's Isle. There's this small supermarket in the town of Bigton, which you go through to get to St Ninian's Isle. The next place I stayed at several nights was at Ardisford Hostel that Martyn alluded to earlier, on the southern part of Unst. And although I didn't stay in any churches, I didn't wild camp, that hostel, I would say, was the most memorable site because although it's a hostel, it's also got a campsite, and I don't think you really need to book to stay with a tent, whereas you might need to with a camper van or if you're staying in the hostel. But camping, I forget how much it was either £12 or £14, but in a tent, but that would give you access to using the facilities, which included kitchen, lounge. There's a sunroom at the back, which is probably only about 50, no, not even that, maybe 30 metres from that to the water's edge, where I was watching otters in the water. So that was my most memorable spot. I bypassed Yell to begin with because not great weather was forecast. I thought what I'd read, I thought it'd be better to be marooned in Unst rather than Yell. as it wasn't too bad. But leaving my stuff there, on one day I went round Haroldswick, which is sort of the major town. Major town's not the right word. Largest village in Unst. And then another day I went to the Hermanus Nature Reserve. I did use the opportunity of leaving stuff at a site for a couple of days, if only to then travel light onto somewhere.
It was really interesting going to the southernmost in Sunbury. It's only the lighthouse, but I think because we just arrived, it was that lovely feeling. It was a real good destination to get off the ferry in the morning and have somewhere to go. We did it was the first wild camp that we did of the tour. We'd actually gone to a hotel. I did a classic, what I like to do when I'm cycle touring, it's quite good. We found a really nice hotel, the Sunbury Hotel. We went in there, we had a super meal, we used all the facilities. We came out, we'd identified where we were wild camping, there were the public toilets there. So it just ticked so many boxes because it was a good destination. It was a climb up the hill to the Sunbury Lighthouse. We were looking for puffins, which we saw on the water, but disappointingly not within the cliffs. So they were sort of really little dots, but we were assured there were puffins. So the walk up, the views from there, the cliff top views, the actual lighthouse, the meal, super meal, and then coming out at night to cycle a short distance to camp, a wild spot that we'd identified, which had toilet facilities as well nearby. So there was such a tick for me of a destination that really works when you're on cycle touring. So that worked brilliantly. And then Tim's already mentioned the Haroldswick, which again, that was fabulous. And up right upon Unst would also be a favourite of mine. I think of the islands, Unst definitely ticks all the boxes. It's wild, it's got good destinations, it's got the history, it's got the Viking history there. The cafes were there. We went in twice to the cafe in Haroldswick. We just sort of connected with the people. We're talking to them. So it's really good, interesting. And then, of course, we went up to the northernmost point. And whilst we were taking photographs, we'd gone, like Jayne mentioned, we went for the swim. And then we came back, and it was the last house in the UK. And we were taking photographs. And the owner came out and invited us in for a wee dram. And invited into the house. He had a little book, a visitor's book, which he asked us to sign. He was talking about the house. He no longer lives there now, but it's been in the family for generations. And it was just good to connect with the people and to talk to him as well. So for me, the two places would be really basically the most south and the most north.
I'd certainly recommend getting out to Escherness and maybe getting off the bike and going walking along the coast there, because it's got some amazing rock stacks and quite a few which are featured in the Shetland TV series, which my wife always says is that the things that she noticed about the Shetland TV series is that the sun's never out. But Escherness is quite interesting geologically. I think there is some archaeological stuff near Sunbury, just in fact as you come, there's Jars Holt, I think it is, which is quite interesting. But the whole island is covered with things if you care to find them out. And what I would definitely recommend is when you're in Lerwick is to go to the cultural centre. There's a museum there, which is, I think, one of the best, sort of museums that talks about the history of Shetland and the fishing industry and the oil industry and all of these things. And it's absolutely fascinating. It's really well put together and very interesting. And that will give you an insight into the island as a whole. And it's a good thing perhaps to do when you get off the ferry, is to go there and see what it is that particularly interests you, and then go and have a look at it. Yeah, the other thing I'd also check out before you go at a particular time is music, because there's a lot of very good music which is held at the cultural centre in Lerwick and in other places. You'll come across it all the time, and I think they have festivals. So I've been there a couple of times when they've had the tall ships go in. That was incredible. But I've also been there when they've had folk festivals on, and fiddle festivals particularly. and that's extraordinary to sort of just to be observe that and observe the locals coming together and expressing their culture and their heritage.
There were a lot more tourists cycling on Orkney. In Shetland, we saw another couple, two or three. That was all, as from memory. Memory serves me right. Not many at all on Shetland. I think the ones we did see, we seemed to be going into the wind when we had the wind with us, so they weren't for stopping and talking because they were battling the wind against.
I found a common theme of this trip was that I did bump into many people again and again. There's a couple that I met queuing for the ferry that I then bumped into again some days later, and at about 5 campsites I kept meeting this guy called Mark, who it turned out had been on the same ferry as me initially, but we just hadn't met then. I mentioned the Dutch guy that was doing the North Sea cycle route. I met him on his way up and on his way south. And also on a non-cycling thing, I met up with a colleague of mine that happened to be a former colleague of mine that happened to be in the area, and just about 4 or 5 different times round Unts, we just kept bumping into each other at completely different locations. And on another non-cycling front, I turn up at campsites and people say, "Oh, we saw you a couple of days ago." These are people in cars, but just maybe my bike or just the fact that they'd see me about the place. But it's quite a community of travellers, not in addition to the community of the local residents. I had 2 weeks available. I didn't think I could see enough for me to do enough justice to Shetland. I will do Orkney sometime. It won't, I didn't do it this year. I did think about it because clearly you can get a ferry between the islands. You've got an easier ferry between the Scottish mainland and Orkney. All options are valid. I think for me, I did the right option, but I totally accept that other options are also valid. I mean, I didn't see that much of it in the 2 weeks. I still didn't see the bit beyond Bray, like I said previously.
Also, logically for us, it worked out really well. We're getting the ferry from Aberdeen up to Lerwick. We then timed it to get the ferry that Tim was talking about that then goes from Lerwick to Kirkwall. We were then able to do very much as we did in the Shetlands, which was go out and do either loops. It's like there are more roads and it gives you a little bit more flexibility of planning and routes. But we were able to do it, but it leaves you the option then to move from the very south of the Orkneys, and you can then just do a mainland skip from St Mary's Hope down to Gills Bay on the mainland. So it's quite a short hop across. So it makes a really nice logistic tour when you're planning your route finding.
Yeah, the Orkney is really mainland Orkney, which can be quite busy because the cruise liners come into Kirkwall and they can completely dominate. I think it's the busiest cruise liner port in the British Isles. What I would really encourage people to do if they go to Orkney is to get out to the islands, particularly Sanday or Westray or Strathensay or Eday. And there's a beautiful, sort of ferry network which is run by the Orkney Island Council. It's very inexpensive. You get to meet a lot of people on the ferries. And instead of, just maybe going out to Westray for a day, you go out to Westray for a couple of days and then go to Papa Westray or Pape. And it's almost as when you go to Scotland, it's like level 1 relaxation. Then you go to Orkney, that's level 2 relaxation. Then you go to Westray, it's level 3 relaxation. You go to Papa Westray. You're horizontal at this point, and I think there is a level beyond that. But it's just stunningly quiet and beautiful, and the beaches are just sublime. I think they must be the best beaches in the whole of the northwest of the British Isles. Maybe the Western Isles can compete with those, but even in peak season in August, you're not going to come across very many people, and the opportunities for wild camping and the opportunities for sort of exploring also the archaeological and the bird life and all of these sorts of things is truly stunning. And I got introduced. Somebody said, "Why didn't you go to Orkney one year?" I was a regular in Scotland, and I went once, and then I've just found myself completely bewitched by the place, and I go back there as often as I can. And typically with a camper van with a bike, and then go to the islands, and then just cycle around the islands. There's no traffic at all, and you can really relax and explore the islands. And the opportunity for wild camping is just superb.
They're both very different. I would say Shetland is more rugged and more open to the elements. Orkney was softer. We did stay on the mainland just because of the logistics of ferries and what we wanted to do. We cycled all the way around the north coast of the mainland and down to Stromness, and then we caught the ferry onto Hoy, which was stunning in itself. We walked up to the Old Man of Hoy, which I think was probably one of my favourite moments there. I just think there's probably more to do and see on Orkney than there was on Shetland. There's a lot more Neolithic villages. There's Scarabray, which is from 3000 BC, I think it was, an old settlement. There's the Standing Stones. Kirkwall itself was beautiful with its little harbour. Stromness was really pretty. So if I had to spend another week on, I would say I would go back to Orkney just because there's more to do and see there, and Shetland is quite a bit further away.
Oh, Orkney always was on the list, and it's been reinforced on the list. But to go to your question, if I had an extra week, which would I choose? I probably at the moment would do a further week in Shetland to complete or to do a bit more of what I missed. But if someone said, "Oh, sorry, you've got to do Orkney," it would be no hardship.
I would recommend that you went all the way to the top, to Unst, and covered right from top to bottom. And I would also say just check out if there's any music festivals or any things that are going to take up the hotels and hostels, because when we were there was a lot of university open days, and we couldn't get into a couple of accommodations that we were thinking we might do. So if you wanted to pre-book accommodation, I would just make sure that you can get in nice and early. But my top tip would be to do north to south or south to north.
On Shetland, I would seek out the seafood. It's amazing. There's a place in Scalloway which is part of the university research, and they've got a little cafeteria there. And there's also a famous chippy near Bray called Frankie's. You get a little flag in your fish. It tells you what boat it's caught it and everything. But the quality of the food is just, if you get a scallop, you can't believe the size of the thing. It's just fantastic. So I would definitely seek out the seafood.
We use the campsite in Bray, and it's quite quick because almost like wild camping, you've got the use of the bar when it's open and the toilet facilities of the boating club there. But they allow campsites, but it's a very rough field, and in fact we ended up camping literally more or less on the cliff top edge, and there it was pretty wild. But you've got full facilities. You got some shelter from the building, and so that was. But then, talking, they have the fish and chip shop. They had Frankie's, but we actually had another. The main hotel in town was pre-booked, but we were recommended a little boutique type hotel, which was just out of town, which we were able to cycle to, and that we had a fabulous evening meal at. The first night we used Frankie's fish and chips. On the second night we went out to this little boutique hotel. Fabulous meal there, and then we cycled back to the campsite, and that was great.
I don't know about one top tip, but I certainly agree with Jane's point about going right to the north. Before you go, I'd recommend going to the Shetland Times website, and on that you can get a guidebook and an accommodation book. You just pay postage for them. Unfortunately, the accommodation book only has about 4 campsites. There are about 10 campsites listed in a guide that you can get from lots of other campsites. The guidebook I mentioned does list all of the festivals, and as Martyn stated, you've got the folk festival that this year is between the 2nd and 5th of May, but there's a whole load of other things going on throughout the year Other top tips: travel as light as you can, because it's not very flat. That's possibly more for my benefit, being from Somerset, whereas Andrew, I think you're used to hills, being in Yorkshire. I did have a drone with me, but I'd say that there are not that many places I felt comfortable using it, because there are a lot of birds by cliffs, and I didn't even think about getting out when I saw birds. Definitely go to the north. You just need to get yourself there. Top tip.
My first book, which is called Tales from the Big Trails, was really about my experience of walking the 19 national trails. And I'm in the middle of, in fact, writing book number 2, which is about my walking around the English coast. There's the third book that's still in my head. I've got all the notes to write about my North Sea cycle route, and also to write about a journey from Land's End to John O'Groats, going around the west coast of Ireland, the Wild Atlantic Way. What I like about writing is that it forces you to reflect on the journey and put things down into word and to process it. And it's a really nice way of, memorizing and remembering your journey, and putting it down and setting it almost in posterity, even just for your own sake. It doesn't have to be read by anybody else, but it's a really good way of processing your thoughts about any form of travel, I would say. And I think that Shetland and Orkney has plenty of really interesting material which you could write about. I'm in a bit of a sort of end of England coast path walk. I only just finished on Saturday, walking 2,400 miles, and I'm actually thinking about sort of going back into cycle touring. What I would say, I mean, about Shetland and Orkney, is that there's the combination of ferries and cycling that seems to work. It's quite relaxed. Instead of doing big distances, I cycled round the Inner Hebrides, or I didn't cycle round them, but I would go to the ports and then put a bike on to go to Colonsay or Isla or Jura, and that was particularly good for wild camping and very relaxed. You don't have much distance, but as soon as the ferry turns around and heads back to the mainland, it becomes really quiet. There's no traffic, and you can just really relax and explore the lanes and the beaches. And then, 9 o'clock in the evening, when there's still plenty of light in June or whenever, you just sort of pitch on a beach, and it's just truly fantastic. So there's that combination. I'm particularly interested in any sort of networks of islands and cycle touring using ferries and networks of islands, and Norway offers that as well. But certainly, I'd recommend Scotland. I just find that's really, really good fun to go cycle touring with a combination of ferries and islands. Is fantastic.
Immediately in July, we're going to the Welsh Cycle Touring Festival at Ruthin. But next year, Anne and I are talking through visiting the Balkan countries, 4 or 5 countries in the Balkans, over a 5-6 week period next year. So that's the next planning in the pipeline. It's at an early stage, but that's what we're thinking.
I've managed to fit in a week cycling in Girona, and I've just been up to Kirkby Stephen Hostel, which is a fabulous little hostel in the northern Dales of Cumbria, Dales in Eden Valley. It's a great little base for anybody looking for a few days away. The Kirkby Stephen Hostel's good cycling, good options. So I've just been there. I'm going over to the North York Moors for a few days, exploring that area with the bike, in accommodation, and I'm training a little bit this year. I want to cycle. I'm booked to go across the Alps this year later on in September. So I really need to get some hills and some distance under my belt to get across the Alps. It's one of these sort of challenge across the Alps in 8 days, which I'm going to find quite tough, because I'm normally cycle touring pace, which is nice and slow and leisurely. And this one I'm going to have to push a little bit more. Going to Ruthin to the Welsh Cycle Touring Festival, which is excellent. Great few days down in Ruthin, camping at the rugby club, and out and about locally, exploring the Dales, which are on my doorstep.
I actually don't have any fixed plans for where to cycle next, but the other options that were considered this year was either to do Portugal, something similar to Rob Ainsley's end-to-end going along the N2. Another option is cycle touring in Ireland. I'm also quite tempted at some point to repeat the Venice to Munich cycle route that I did last year, but with a slight variation, or with a few variations, but that's not planned yet.
Thank you to Tim and to Anne and to Jayne and to Martyn for offering their thoughts there. The question is, will I be travelling to Shetland and perhaps Orkney myself this summer? I'm still undecided. Got a few weeks to make my decision. I've been cycle touring and cycling in Scotland a few times. The first time was back in 2014, and I was preparing to cycle the following year in Norway, and I decided that I needed some experience of cycling in a potentially hostile environment. So I took the bike on the night train all the way up to the north of Scotland, to Thurso, cycled along the north coast and then down the west coast. And I have to say, the weather that Scotland threw at me during those 10 days was far worse than anything I subsequently experienced in Norway the following year in 2015. However, I've been back a couple of times. In 2020, as part of my Great British Cycle Tour, I cycled up the east coast towards Edinburgh, and I had great weather. Deteriorated somewhat when I cycled between Edinburgh and Glasgow, when the downpours were biblical. But then, again, it picked up again, cycling from Glasgow down to the ferry port at Stranraer. And then the third time I went was when I cycled the Hebridean Way in 2021. And I have to say then, the weather was fantastic, and I couldn't have wished for a better opportunity to visit, especially the island of Harris. The beaches on the island of Harris were just fantastic. So it is a bit of a lottery with the weather. So I don't know, I have the luxury of having 6 weeks as a teacher, so perhaps I should just hold back, watch the weather forecast and choose my moment. And then if I see a window of opportunity of what looks like reasonable weather, I should quickly get online, book a ferry to travel to Lerwick and then start cycling. If I do, you'll hear about it on the Cycling Europe podcast. So again, thank you to Tim, to Anne, to Jayne and to Martyn for their contributions. Thank you to Rob Ainsley for providing the music, of course. This has been episode 81 of the Cycling Europe podcast. If you'd like to get in contact with the podcast, then all the details are on cyclingeurope.org/contact. And if you'd like to help support the podcast, then all the details as to how to do that you can find at cyclingeurope.org/support. The easiest way to support the podcast is simply by writing a review or giving a rating on the podcast platform where you happen to be listening to this on. So thank you for listening. Look out for episode 82 very soon. Don't know when that will be out, but hopefully in the next few weeks. I've no idea who's going to be on it because I've run out of interviewees. So if you'd like to be one of them, get in contact and perhaps you could be the subject of episode 82 of the Cycling Europe podcast. So thank you for listening and happy cycling.